Our next speaker is Daniel Atilano Barbosa. He works at the Faculty of Psychology in the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Y el tema de su charla es Moral Emotions and Brain Function, a Neurosocial Approach.
Well, thanks for the Lombardo's team for the invitation in this day. I will talk to you about moral emotions, brain function, and neurosocial approach. I would like to say that this is not a theoretical or philosophical work. This is more an experimental project. So I would like you to make an advice. So if you don't, my intention is don't to break the line of this colloquium. Okay. So I will introduce my object of study that is the human brain. I use this concept, the social brain, because for social neuroscience, the human brain is a complex organ that have subsystems that process a specific kind of information. In this topic is social relevant information, like I mentioned here, is face perception, voice perception, motor resonance, affect sharing, mentalizing, emotion experience, and emotion regulation. This concept is really interesting in neuroscience because the brain isn't an how to say, like an organ that is isolated from the social context. We use the principle of neural plasticity to explain that these modules are regulated by the social context. By the theme of my topic this day of moral emotion, I will focus only in these modules: the mentalizing network, the emotional experience network, and the emotion regulation network. Okay, so only to mention a few regions that are involved in this process. For mentalizing are the precuneus, the medial prefrontal cortex, the temporoparietal junction, and the temporal pole. And for emotional experience are the insula and the amygdala regions, also the cingulate cortex. So in this sense, I will introduce for my theoretical framework the moral feelings that was constructed by Adam Smith. Adam Smith said that through the feelings occurs an apprehension of the good and the evil, motivating a moral action that naturally allows us to identify with the other. Basically, it said that we make a moral judgment based in our emotional experience. In recent days, Jonathan Haidt had proposed the social intuitionist model that said that moral judgment arises from automatic and unconscious process in form of emotion, and that moral reason arises to justify the initial judgment that results from this intuitive process. So, by this theoretical framework, I make this diagram where I need to make sense of my concept study of moral emotion, and I propose that moral emotions come from the perception of a moral transgression, and that this lend us to experience emotion of affliction and wellness. And these emotions evoke moral judgment and also behavior or cognitive states aimed at restoring the transgression period. Also, it's important an empathic process because the mentalizing network, this cognitive process to infer the mental state of others, is important to evoke these emotions and also this emotional contagion that we may experiment when we see another person in suffer. So also it's important the social context because the social context is interacting with this perception of what is a moral transgression, but by the social norms or the moral principles. So, based on all these studies, we can divide moral emotion in four big families. I will only focus in both of these that are emotion of condemnation, specifically indignation and envy, and emotion from the other sufferer, that is compassion and Schadenfreude. So compassion is an emotion unleashed by the perception of the other's affliction, which motivates the observer to take action aimed at relieving the suffering. So if we read this sentence, we may experience feelings of affliction because we are perceiving a harm in this subject. And social neuroscience said to us that when we perceive this kind of stimulus, a functional magnetic resonance said to us that this brain region, that is the cingulate cortex, is activated related to this emotional experience, as you remember that I mentioned in the first slide. And this region, that is the orbitofrontal cortex, that is related to making a moral judgment. And this component of feelings of affliction is the negative component of compassion. Also, when we read this kind of sentence, we may experience an ambivalent feelings in contrast with feelings of affliction that are feelings of wellness, because we perceive a restoration in the subject. Social neuroscience says to us that when we perceive this kind of stimulus, only focus in the brain regions colored in blue, that specifically this region, that is the nucleus accumbens, that is the region associated with pleasure and excitement, has been involved in these feelings of wellness. And by my theoretical framework, this will be the positive component of compassion. On the other hand, envy, indignation, and Schadenfreude, from this theoretical framework, when we perceive this kind of stimulus, we may arise these feelings of resentment or inferiority, because we make a perception of a material or social benefit in another person. This only kind of process may experience of the emotion of envy. But when we perceive that that benefit obtained by this person is obtained from a moral transgression, we may evoke a judgment of injustice, and this is what is called the indignation. Taking into account that feelings of resentment and inferiority also have influence in this kind of moral emotion. And social neuroscience said to us that when we perceive this experience, when we experience this indignation, these are the brain function related to this kind of experience, the right insula, that is this region, and the medial frontal gyrus, that there are these both regions colored in red. On the other hand, when we perceive this kind of sentence, we may experience feelings of wellness and pleasure, because we are perceiving a punishment or deserved suffering as a result of a moral violation committed by this person. And we also may evoke a judgment of justice because he's receiving a punishment. This is what is called Schadenfreude. And social neuroscience said to us that the caudate nucleus, this region associated with pleasure and excitement, is activated when we experience this feeling of Schadenfreude. But the limitations of most of the studies in social neuroscience, first of all, they are artificial stimulus, like the trolley dilemma. We don't go everyday life and face this kind of dilemma. Also, social neuroscience and neuroscience in general use ambiguous sociocultural stimulus that we don't know where they come from. No? So the proposal of this project is to use stimulus that represent the sociocultural context of the person. In specific, in Mexico, we propose the use of news as a stimulus of real events and as a stimulus that are indicator of the social and political conflicts. So, only to mention, this is a national survey of how Mexicans perceive the sociocultural context. I focus on this time because these were the years where the project was arising. So, by these years, the most Mexicans perceive insecurity, all of this, but I will only focus in these three: insecurity, corruption, impunity, and narcotraffic, that are related with this theoretical framework of moral emotion of perceiving a transgression. Okay? So, based on this theoretical framework, it comes the research question, that is, what is the brain function associated with the emotional experience when reading journalistic news regarding situation of affliction and welfare in third person as a result of normative or moral transgression? So we make a study. We validate and select the journalistic use that may be used in a brain functional paradigm. So the first methodology is to select a bunch of news. We select 18 news of situation referring to affliction and wellness in other person in this time lapse, and we categorize 20 news in these categories that are congruent with the moral emotions that I mentioned before. It's basically affliction for affliction, that is this negative component of compassion; wellness for wellness, that is this positive component of compassion; wellness for affliction, that is this moral emotion of Schadenfreude; and affliction for wellness, that correspond to envy and indignation. All the sentences were constructed in a similar grammatical design. All sentences begin with a mention to the temporality, the subject, the verb, the cause, and the complement of the sentence. We to respond to our question, what is the emotional experience when subjects perceive this stimulus in form of journalistic news? We based in the chromatic model of emotions from José Luis Díaz, that states that emotion can be categorized in an orthogonal dimension, from pleasure to displeasure and calm and excitement. We'll focus in these 8 emotion colors in green that are positive and negative emotions. And we also create emotional and moral evaluation scale with 110 university students, and this scale was constructed in a Likert scale that goes to this experience of I don't feel nothing, and to this experience of I feel an intense emotion. And we add a moral dimension, asking the subject if the event that was reflected in the journalistic news, if they perceive it like fair or unfair. This is an example of this scale. Sorry, it's in Spanish because it's the original. So we present them the news. This is the sentence of the news, and these are the 8 emotions and the 2 moral dimensions. No? This is the Likert scale. So now results were the following. For the emotions that we suppose evoke the negative component of compassion, this is an example of this category, this sentence of journalistic news. We found the following. This is a graph representing the average response of our 110 university students, and they report that compassion, implicitness, sadness, negative emotions were the emotions that were more experiencing intensity. This is on a scale of intensity. And in the moral domain, the unfairness, this this dimension related to moral judgment of injustice was highly reported. In the other category, in wellness for wellness, corresponding to the positive component of compassion, so as is an example, we found the contrary, the antagonist results that I explained before. Compassion, pleasantness, and happiness, positive emotions were more reported in our subject, and the moral domain, of fairness related to justice was highly reported. On the other hand, this moral emotion of Schadenfreude, an example of this stimulus, we found something interesting. Our subjects appear to don't have an experiential emotion highly reported, because we see that basically none of these emotions were highly reported, but the moral domain of fairness is related to the sense of justice was highly reported to when subjects perceive this kind of stimulus. And in the final category of envy indignation, we found that anger, unpleasantness, and the moral domain of unfairness was highly reported. So these results only said to us that we can have a stimulus that evoke this moral emotion of our interest. So we make this hypothesis that based on this difference, we will expect difference in brain function during the reading and emotional experience of news belonging to different moral emotions. So this comes our second study, brain function. Basically, I will be fast. Subject enter to this magnetic resonance. We present this following task. The ready task is basically the subject needs to push a button, so we will assure that they were not sleeping inside the resonance. Then we present the news. Then we ask what they feel regarding the perception of the news. This was called the feeling condition, and this was called the reading condition. And then we lend some time so that the subject can make some introspection about their emotional experience. We found this only to mention the methodology of brain resonance imaging is to contrast conditions. So this don't suppose that there is no brain function. Always is brain function in our brains. But in making this contrast, we don't find brain significantly brain function. Only we have significantly brain function when subject reads a journalistic news regarding envy and indignation. And these were based on this methodological element, we suppose that this is similar cerebral function when a subject perceives this kind of stimulus related to this moral emotion. These were the findings when participants read this kind of journalistic news. We found significant hyperactivation in the occipital and the cerebellum zones, the cingulate cortex, the temporal lobe, and the temporoparietal junction. These regions are associated first the occipital and the cerebellum to the perceptual relevance of the stimulus and an affective motor process. The cingulate is related to a detection of a moral conflict and a detection of unfavorable outcome to the perceiver. The posterior temporal lobe is related to an integration of social information, and the temporoparietal junction to this network of mentalization and this difference between intentional harm and accidental harm. This comes sense because this kind of new reflects situation that expose social or material benefit obtained by people that commit a norm or moral transgression, and based on this kind of result, we infer that these regions are related to the inference of mental state associated to violation of social norms. Also, we found that when we lend the participant to experience their feelings after reading news regarding negative compassion. We found that there is a relevant brain activation. This brain activation was related to basically auto-introspection processes by the activation of precuneus and posterior cingulate, and we inferred that this kind of news, when participants read news that evokes negative compassion, produce auto-reflective processes during consciousness experiential states. So basically the conclusion of this study is that the use of journalistic news allows us to simulate the Mexican social context to study brain function related to moral emotion by the perception of affliction and wellness in other persons. Second, the emotional experience related to reading news that elicits the antagonist moral emotion like compassion and schadenfreude is subjectively diversified by the result of the psychometric study, but functionally supported by the same brain region. And finally, reading news that evokes envy and indignation involves brain function related to the evaluation of the intention of the actions and the detection of transgression of social norms, possibly related to the perception of corruption, insecurity, and mistrust of the Mexican socio-political context. And well, only to mention, this is my teamwork that participate in this project: Dr. Roberto Mercadillo, Lorena Paez, and Dr. Eric Pasalle. Thanks.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Roberto. La verdad, muy claro. Pero tengo un problema. I'm sorry, English. I have a problem with the wellness for affliction examples because they are kind of odd. Especially the first example you give, where you have the person who is beaten to death because they had done something horrible. I'm not even going to repeat it because it's horrible, the example you used. But then it is clear that it's a very different thing going on there because there are actually two actions that are being referenced. So maybe that would explain why the emotional response is kind of off, because you're asking, how do you feel? I'm like, do I feel about the person being beaten to death or what he did to those little boys? So maybe that is one of the reasons, because the question, as you said, just the general question, how do you feel? And maybe, how did you notice that? Did you try to avoid it in any way?
Well, methodological problem when we select this kind of stimulus, because this is an example. If we perceive this stimulus, we may feel good because the man received a punishment, like a karma. No? But we may also feel bad because they killed two people. So the use of this kind of stimulus is complicated in the experimental method because subjects may experience different kind of emotions. So this is the result of these kinds of stimulus, because participants said, well, I can experience too much pleasantness, but also too much unpleasantness. So I will go to the moral dimension of fairness because he received a punishment. So in the brain function analysis, it may suppose that also, because there was no experience and emotion, we didn't find brain function significant activation. So it's a problem that we are, do we have in mind? So I don't, we make a third study. I don't present this third study. After the participant exit the magnetic resonance, we present them again all the stimulus, and like in an interpersonal interview, we ask them and we record their voices, what they feel and why they feel that, and if they feel this kind of emotion in other contexts. So we are planning to make an analysis of discourse and try to make a connection with this analysis, like more experiential, with brain function and psychometric properties.
Daniel, very nice. I have two questions about the details of the experiment. One is, do you think that the sample would change a lot when you have like this age of the participants? I mean, the L, you said it's around 20, a bit less. So don't you think the sample would change really a lot if they were, for example, between around 30 or around 50 years old? Because when the younger you are, the less prone to have like very well-defined emotions in terms of morality. That's the first one. And the second is, how do you reckon they reply about emotions when you ask them, what do you feel? Do they press a button, or do you present them as like 5 or 10 possible responses?
The first question, I will try to answer that. That's a methodological problem in neuroscience, and I think in all experimental psychological paradigms, because the participants that always want to participate are the university students. It's not the man that is selling tacos outside. This is a problem because they have a background, university students, and have a contextual knowledge about their social context. So it may also, the age of the participants have an influence in our results, and also the career of these university students. I don't mention, but mostly of them were studying anthropology in the University of Querétaro. So their background may influence our results also. So this is a thing that we have also in mind. And in the second, to respond to the second question, this kind of task is really new. We have no antecedent of other neuroimaging study that ask participants, what do you feel? Mostly of them, of other studies, they put items, and participants with buttons select one of the emotions that may be involved. Our purpose of putting this task is to make some opportunity to the participants to make an introspection. We have been criticized with this task, especially in the Neurobiological Institute, but because we are not controlling many other variables. But our first interest is, what do you feel is the pure emotional experience. So the subject can make introspection by freedom to say something, no?
Is there any other?
Do you get any results that you didn't expect at all?
Well, that's an interesting question. First of all, I think this was the result. Schadenfreude in Mexico is like como alegría ajena, because we feel good when something is having something bad, no? So I was really amused, because Mexicans is like, we always laugh. Our culture, no, like the death, no, the tradition of making like a kind of laughing to this mythical sense of death, no. We have a tradition, the Dia de Muertos, and this kind of humor negro that we have. So I don't. This was a really kind of interesting result, and we suppose that participants don't only don't know how to express their emotion, but they have a salience. They make that they can make a moral judgment, and they we suppose that the fairness option was the best kind of option they can make, no. We are expecting more analysis, but these are like preliminary analysis. We are hoping to make some other.
Okay, any other question? Oh, seems that there's no question. Thank you very much. Start with our key speaker, Professor Michael Bishop, and the name of the talk is The Mechanics of Happiness.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for such a great conference. Some conferences, the conference is great and the post-conference events are just okay. Some conferences, the post-conferences events are great, but the conference is just okay. And this conference, at least so far, I hope I don't ruin it, the conference has been great and the post-conference events have been great as well. So thank you so much. And by the way, si es que alguien quiera hacerme preguntas en español, yo puedo entender español, pero voy a hablar en inglés. Okay, so our object of study today, what I want to talk about today is what philosophers call well-being, a life that's good or valuable for the person who lives it. Philosophers call this well-being, psychologists call it happiness or being happy or living a happy life. But again, the idea is this is a life that's supposed to be good for you. So think about what you want for your children or what you want for a loved one. You want them to have a life that's good for them, that's a life in which they're happy or in which they have high well-being. That's what I want to talk about today. And the issue that I want to address, I hope there's some psychologists here. The issue I want to address is, look, philosophers and psychologists both think they're studying happy lives, okay? Lives of high well-being. Philosophers study it in the armchair. Psychologists study in the lab. Sometimes they go out in the world and study it. And the question I want to ask is, what's the relationship between these two endeavors? What's the relationship between what philosophers do in the armchair and what psychologists do in the lab when they're studying these things? So maybe they're studying totally different things, or maybe they're studying the same thing. Well, I'm going to start with the assumption that they're studying the same thing and see what happens. So here's an overview of the talk. I want to ask what's positive psychology, which is what psychologists tend to call the study of happiness, or at least the psychological study of happiness. I want to ask what it's about. Then I want to talk about normalizing the study of happiness. Then I'm going to offer you some models of happiness. And then once we figure out what the right model of happiness, this is what I think psychologists are doing, offering models of happy lives. And then what's left for philosophers to do once psychologists have answered all the empirical questions? Is there anything left for philosophers to do? Now, so this in a sense is a different sort of talk for me. Usually my talks are, philosophers, you guys should pay more attention to what the psychologists are saying. But here what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk mostly for the psychologists, because here's what happens. When I talk to psychologists, I sometimes ask them, what's the one thing, if philosophers could, work on a problem that would help you in your research, what would that problem be? And I always get sort of the stare like, I don't even know what you guys do. So I want to maybe suggest that here's what we do, and here's how it might connect up to what you do when you study happiness. Okay? So, what's positive psychology about? Well, biologists can tell us what cytology is, right? It's the study of cells. Now, you'd think that psychologists would be able to tell us what positive psychology is, but as a matter of fact, they're all over the map. Let me give you some examples. So here's Peterson saying that it's positive psychology is the scientific study of what goes right in life. Okay, well that's sort of interesting. Not the clearest articulation of what a scientific discipline might study, but okay. Keyes and Haidt say positive psychology aims to help people live and flourish rather than merely to exist. Okay, well, flourishing is an interesting concept, but it's a philosophical concept, and it's something that you should probably explain. Wright and Lopez say the label positive psychology represents those efforts of professionals to help people optimize human functioning. Okay, but what exactly does that mean? It would be nice to know. Now, Seligman and Csikszentmihalyi people who coined the term positive psychology, when they explain what positive psychology is, they just give a huge laundry list of things that positive psychologists study, and it's not even an exhaustive list. Right? It's just, here's a whole bunch of stuff that we study. It's that stuff. So what I want to suggest is we should normalize the study of happiness. So in thinking about happiness, what I want to suggest to psychologists is that we should normalize the study of happiness. What does that mean? It means that we should understand the study of happiness to be no different in principle from the study of any other scientific category, like atoms or genes. Okay, so that's the basic idea that I want to suggest. So if you were to ask a physicist in 1900 what an atom was, or a biologist in 1950 what a gene was, well, what they'd have done is they would have sketched a number of models, a number of abstract and sometimes idealized descriptions of the posit in question. Some of these models would be very modest and wouldn't make a lot of assumptions about the world, and they'd be widely shared. Other models might be more risky and controversial, and they say, well, here's what I think genes are, here's what I think the right model of an atom is. And what I want to suggest is that we should expect the same when it comes to happiness. Okay? All right. So let's look at some models of happiness. So here's my suggestion. You look at the positive psychology literature, and there's a lot of interesting stuff, but they're not clear about what they're doing. Here, I want to make a suggestion. Here's what psychologists are doing when they are studying happiness. And if I'm right, that this is what psychologists are doing when they're studying happiness, then we get a number of different characterizations of positive psychology which might be useful and that psychologists might be able to sort of agree on. So here's what I call the basic model, or it's the no theory of happiness. Okay? And here the basic idea is that a person's enduring happiness is sustained by a process or processes she instantiates. So the idea is that happiness, when you're happy, when you're having a happy life, you instantiate a process. Now this process, notice there's some question marks here, and the arrows you shouldn't take too seriously. Okay, so, but a process is just a causally linked chain of events. Now, I'll bet you have questions about this process. Good, because the basic model doesn't answer them. Okay? Look, from the perspective of the basic model, the answer is, well, that's what we're trying to figure out, right? So here's a bunch of questions you might ask. I'll bet you have questions about the relationship between happiness and the processes that sustain it, right? So sustain, I put that in both scare quotes and yellow to make clear that that's just a word that doesn't really mean very much. Okay, what exactly that means, again, that's what we'll figure out when we've studied happiness more. So here's some possibilities. Is happiness an element of the process? So is happiness that right there? Right? Or is happiness a cause of the process? It's not in the process, it's a cause of the process. Or is happiness an effect of the process? Well, it could be any of those. Does happiness supervene on the process? All right, if you're not a philosopher, you probably don't understand what that means. Don't worry about it. Okay. Is happiness just identical to the process? Is that process all there is to happiness? Or does happiness bear some other relationship to that process? The basic model. Great questions. The basic model answers none of them. Again, the basic model is just committed to the idea that there's a process we're studying, and it's a process that sustains happy lives, and that's all I'm going to tell you. If you have more questions, then the answer to those questions are, dude, it's an empirical question. We're trying to figure that out. Okay? You don't have to have the dude part. So if it doesn't answer any of these questions, you might say, well, what good is the basic model? Right? It doesn't answer any of the questions that you have about happiness. So what good is it? Well, I think the basic model explains 3 apparent facts about happiness, about happy lives. Okay? So it explains 3. Now you might say, I don't believe these are facts, but I think that there's good evidence that these are facts. So, well, technically the third one is the fact about happy lives, but the first 2 are facts about happy lives. So happiness, think about somebody you know who is happy And it just seems to go on for years and decades, and it doesn't seem to come hard to them, right? I hate those people. Think about it like a person that you say, they're just a happy person, right? Okay, well, how is it? Why is it that happiness can last for years or even decades? Well, the basic model has an answer. It says happiness can last for years, even decades, because the processes that sustain happy lives can last for years, even decades. Okay? The diversity of happy lives. So happy lives can take many forms. Well, yeah, because the processes that sustain happy lives can take many forms. They can be instantiated by many different people who have very different personalities, who are in very different physical and social environments. Okay, so that's those are two facts about happy lives that I think the basic model accounts for. It also explains, if you actually know something about positive psychology, I think it explains the structure of positive psychology, why positive psychology looks the way it does. So psychology is investigating the causal structure of these processes that sustain happy lives. So when you go and start reading up on positive psychology, that's what they're doing. And they're also seeking to identify interventions that establish, maintain, or strengthen these processes. So if we adopt the basic model, then positive psychology is the study of the causal processes that sustain happy lives. But this isn't going to be particularly right. You don't want to leave that in there, I think, okay? Because happy is a normative and highly contested notion. We should probably try and eliminate it in favor of something more descriptive. But to do that, we're going to have to be a little more risky. We're going to have to take a few more risks. The basic model, it's a process. Tell us about the process. No, I'm not going to tell you about the process. Okay, but now I'm going to have to tell you a little bit about the process. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the process. I'm going to suggest the FAST model of happiness. Okay, what the heck is that? Well, here you go. Here's the FAST model. Basically, the FAST model tells you what the component parts are of the process that sustains happiness, what the basic parts are, but it doesn't tell you how they're connected or anything. It just tells you what the basic parts are. Okay, so the FAST model is the basic model with the component parts filled in. Now, I've identified 4 parts, but this is an empirical speculation. So if you want to stand up and say, Bishop, I think you're totally wrong. I think 2 of those things really aren't part of the process, and these 2 other things really are part of the process, and you totally messed this up, you might be totally right. Okay, so this is an empirical speculation here. So what do I mean by FAST? Well, here we go. Happiness-sustaining processes are made up of pleasant feelings, positive attitudes, successes, where we understand successes in terms of getting what you want, and virtuous traits, habits or behaviors. Feelings, attitudes, successes, traits, FAST. Okay? Now, why those? Well, what evidence do I have for thinking that it's a FAST process as opposed to some other process? Well, again, one more thing. It takes no stand on the causal structure of FAST processes. All we're doing is identifying the basic elements of these processes. All right, so philosophy. So if philosophers have been studying happy lives, then the idea that happy lives consist of or are sustained by FAST processes makes sense of what philosophers have been doing. What philosophers have been doing is grabbing one part of this process and saying, this is what's crucial to well-being. This is what's crucial to happiness. So, again, very simple account of these various theories, the 4 dominant, in my view, theories of well-being out there today. So hedonism says that a happy life, a life of high well-being, involves pleasant feelings and a lack of unpleasant feelings. Life satisfaction theories take well-being to be an attitude of being pleased or satisfied with your life or with the components of your life. Desire theories take a life of high well-being or a life of happiness to involve success, where that's understood in terms of getting what you want. And Aristotelian theories identify happy lives or lives of well-being with virtuous traits. So it's like philosophers who are like, you know, blind people studying an elephant, where each of them has a part of the process, but nobody has the whole thing. All right, more evidence is if you take a look at the psychology and you look at particular studies, what psychology is doing is identifying correlations and causal relations among pleasant feelings, positive affect, cheerfulness, for example, positive attitudes, optimism, satisfaction with your life, successes, health, income, good grades, healthy relationships, virtuous traits, extroversion, conscientiousness. So, one really brief aside. I think even if you don't like the FAST model as an account of well-being or happiness, I think it's an actually pretty good account of flourishing. So if you think about somebody who's flourishing, the way to think about the FAST process is think about one of these people, those really annoying people to whom happiness just comes very easily. And it seems like, you know, good things just keep coming to them. It's like, you know, but it's not an accident, right? If you actually think about it, it's not an accident. It's the good things in their life today tend to bring about more good things tomorrow. Well, when somebody instantiates a process like that, I think it makes sense to say they're flourishing. So there's a potential account of flourishing. All right. Another really brief aside. If you adopt this FAST model, then you can be a little more descriptive about what positive psychology is about. You can say positive psychology is the study of flourishing, if you take my account of flourishing, or you can just say positive psychology is the study of the structure and dynamics of FAST processes that involve pleasant feelings, positive attitudes, successes, and beneficial traits. And notice, even though there's things in here that need explaining, this is all pretty, you know, this is starting to get pretty descriptive. These are sorts of states that psychologists feel pretty comfortable measuring and writing articles about. All right, enough asides. Let's get back to some models of happy lives. All right, finally, causal explanatory models. Okay, so you had the basic model that says it's a process. Then you have the FAST model that says, okay, it's a process that involves pleasant feelings, positive attitudes, successes, and virtuous traits. Now we're going to give you a causal explanatory model. Now we're taking even more of a risk. Okay, so now we're really going to the very edge of the board and looking down into the pit of despair. So these are idealized descriptions, very idealized descriptions of how the processes that sustain happiness might work. Now, one set of models that very simple to understand, I don't think any of them are going to turn out to be true, that's my suspicion, are essentialist models. But what I want to say is, look, it might turn out that the psychology might turn out to show that one of these essentialist models are true, okay? So the essentialist model basically says that one state of these sorts of processes is essential in the sense that it's causally necessary. So in order to instantiate a FAST process, this state has to be there. So that's the central state, right? This state has to be there. If it's not there, then the FAST process just sort of disappears. Okay? The process that's capable of lasting for years and years, just you don't have that. And in favorable circumstances, it's causally sufficient for flourishing, for instantiating this FAST process. Okay? So that's essentialist models. Now, again, my point here isn't to defend any of these essentialist models, and you know how many we're going to have. We're going to have 4, FAST. You can see where I'm going with this, but again, my point isn't to defend any of these models. In fact, I think they're all probably false. But what I want to point out is, look, these are some of the ways that the psychology might turn out. And I think these are the sorts of things that psychologists, I think this is sort of what they are doing, even if they don't always know what they're doing. And if you find that insulting or totally wrong, I definitely want to hear about it. So the hedonistic model says, look, net pleasure is essential to flourishing. So net pleasure, net pleasant feelings, they tend to bring about beneficial traits, successes, and positive attitudes. Okay. Now, of course, the net pleasant feelings, you might wonder, well, how do you get those? Well, the essentialist model is going to say, well, you know, all sorts of things can give you those, and but it's important to have the net pleasant feelings in order to keep this fast process moving. The Aristotelian model puts virtue in the middle as the essential state in this process. Life satisfaction models put positive attitudes in the center, and desire theories put successes in the center. So the idea here is that everything that strengthens or weakens your flourishing does so by increasing or decreasing success, or whatever it is that's causally essential. Now again, explanatory models, so essentialist models are explanatory models. So why are you happy or unhappy? Well, because you have a lot of, or you don't have very much of the essential property. How can you boost your happiness? Get more of that essential property. Why did your happiness go down? You lost some of that essential property. So now, of course, you get bolder accounts of positive psychology. So a scientist might say, yeah. The basic model, I can give you that, right? And that, I'm going to agree with lots of other psychologists about the basic model, right? There's a process that sustains happy lives, and then I don't tell you much more about that. But I actually think that positive psychology is the study of net pleasure, because I'm a hedonist. I think net pleasure is really what gets it's the engine that gets this process going. So there's 4 accounts there, potential accounts of what positive psychology is. Now, I told you that I don't actually believe the essentialist theories, and there's 2 reasons why I don't believe the essentialist theories or will win the day. But again, I could be wrong. This is a total empirical speculation. One is the Pando challenge. Now, if you remember the first slide that I had a grove of aspen trees. That's Pando. Now, Pando is an 80,000-year-old aspen grove in Utah. Okay, it's really old. And so the idea here is that for the essentialists, the durability of happiness-sustaining processes, because remember, happiness can last for those really annoying people for years or even decades. Well, for the essentialists, to explain the durability of that, they're going to explain it in terms of the durability of the essential property. But the challenge is, well, they need to to explain how this essential property can last for years or even decades. And you can already see a problem with one of the theories, right? If hedonic adaptation is a real thing, that is, if we sort of feel pleasure and it dissipates fairly quickly, then hedonism is not going to be able to explain the long-term existence of these processes. All right, so what explains the durability of the essential property? And I think at least some of the essentialist models are going to have a hard time responding to that challenge. The second is the diversity challenge. So for the essentialists, there are firm limits on the diversity of happy, flourishing lives. Right? The essential property must always be the only causal driver of flourishing. So if according to the hedonist, you don't have a lot of net pleasure over a long period of time, you don't have a happy life. And some people might think that's not right. Again, it strikes me as a risky empirical bet. So I suspect that the essentialist models can't account for the durability and diversity of happy lives. So anti-essentialism, look, the thing is, there's tons of different kinds of anti-essentialism. So no single kind of state is always essential to everybody's flourishing. Right? That's the anti-essentialist view. And there's lots and lots of ways to be an anti-essentialist. Now, I've defended an anti-essentialist model in my 2015 book, and I admit, in fact, I insist that this model is a speculative hypothesis. Okay? So the network theory says, look, the basic elements of fast models tend to be mutually reinforcing. And in fact, if you take a look at the psychological literature, that's what you tend to find. That a lot of these states tend to enforce other, tend to help bring about other states, other fast states, and those states tend to bring about other fast states. So you end up getting not necessarily a cycle, but a network of these fast states that sort of tend to maintain each other. They tend to be mutually reinforcing. So some instances of flourishing don't have an essential property. So for some of you, there may be no essential property. You know, you can, any of these states could drop out, and you'd still have something like a fast process. For other people, there might be an essential property, right? For you, if you didn't have success, maybe there's no way you could have a fast process running. But again, I take this to be an open empirical question. The nice thing about the network theory is that it leaves it an open empirical question. It doesn't close that question. Which fast states are present in a particular fast process? Again, that's an open empirical question. Okay, so your happiness is different from mine, which means that you're instantiating a different process than I am. How are they different? Again, these are empirical questions, not to be settled from the philosophical armchair. And again, for any particular process, which fast states are causally connected to each other? Open empirical question. So how does the network theory respond to the PANDO, the durability challenge? And here's a speculation, and it's a speculation that I'm not the first one to make. Okay, but the basic idea is that fast processes tend to generate resources that they need in order to perpetuate themselves. So in some sense, fast processes are psychological perpetual motion machines. They provide the resources that allow them to continue running, or at least a good number of the resources that allow them to continue running. So consider Barbara Fredrickson's broaden and build hypothesis, right? So her idea is that she has lots of really cool studies where she shows people movies, and so you watch this movie, and either the movie makes you happy, it's a funny movie, or it's a neutral movie, it's just a bunch of sticks falling down, or it's a movie that makes you angry. And she studies the effects of these things, and there's lots of really cool effects of these things. So for example, people who see the funny movie are less likely to fall victim to the own race bias. Anybody know what the own race bias? It's the they all look the same to me bias. So white folks have a hard time distinguishing the faces of black folks. So you show them 20 pictures of black faces, then you show them 40 pictures of black faces and say you saw 20 of these before. Which 20 did you see before? They're way better at white faces than they are at black faces. But show them a movie that makes them laugh, and all of a sudden they do just as well on the black faces as they do on the white faces. There's tons of these sorts of studies, and again, not all of them might be right, but the basic idea is so positive affect tends to broaden how you're thinking. It tends to broaden your desires to go out in the world and do things, and that tends to create durable resources. So it creates physical resources, social resources, you get more friends, psychological resources, you build more resilience. And the thing about those resources is that they last longer than just the happy feeling. Okay, your friends, your good friends, are still your good friends even after the pleasure is gone. Okay? And so you have these durable resources, and they can help bring about more positive affect. Okay, so again, the idea here is that the states that tend to make up fast processes tend to create resources that help maintain these fast processes. So that explains the durability, at least for some people, of happiness. The diversity challenge, I think the network theory does quite well. fast networks can take many different forms. All right. So for the non-essentialist, the psychology of happiness is the study of flourishing, the study of fast networks, what tends to establish, maintain, weaken, and destroy these networks. Okay. So let's suppose that that this really is what psychologists are doing. They're studying the causal structure of these processes that sustain happy lives. And let's suppose that they figure it out. Okay, so they figure it out. They say, okay, here are the states that tend to make up these processes that sustain happy lives. Here's some interventions that will work to get you into a fast process. Here are some interventions that will work to keep you in the fast process or to strengthen your fast process. All right, so they've done that. So what's left for philosophers to do? Okay, so there's a question. So have I offered here a philosophy unemployment plan? Maybe there's nothing left for us philosophers to do once psychologists have figured out the causal structure, that is the structure of the processes that make up or that sustain happy lives, where sustain is just a buzzword that we still have to figure out what it means. That's a sign that maybe there is work for philosophers to do. So again, suppose we find the true model of happiness sustaining processes. Is there anything left for philosophers to do? I think the answer is yes. So one thing is that we can engage in theoretical and conceptual tidying up like what I'm doing here. That's one thing philosophers can do. It's something that sometimes we're good at, sometimes maybe we're not so good at. You guys can tell me how I did. And then after psychologists discover the right model of the processes that sustains happy lives, I think philosophy has at least 3 jobs left to do. Okay, so here's 3 questions for philosophers to answer, and I want to talk a little bit. Philosophers might answer these 3 questions. So, how should we understand the basic elements of happy lives? Right? Hopefully, when I said the fast processes, you said, okay, but you talk about pleasant feelings. What are those? Right? You talk about virtuous traits. What exactly do you mean by that? Right. That's a question. So, what is happiness? Okay, look. Eventually, psychologists, you're going to not be able to use, if you decide to talk this way, sustaining, these processes sustain happy lives, you're not going to be able to get away with that fudge word forever. Okay, so what is the relationship between the processes that sustain happy lives and happiness? And third, what about normativity? Okay, all right, and this is a big one, right? Philosophers will always ask, okay, you've given me this causal model, very interesting, yada, 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 but you know what? Well-being or happy lives are supposed to be valuable. They're supposed to be intrinsically valuable, and I don't see anything in the science that explains how these things can be intrinsically valuable. So there's 3 questions that philosophers can ask. So again, how should we understand these things? And look, philosophers, at least for some of these, I mean, we've been theorizing about these things for 2,500 years. We have a lot of things to say about them. Some of these, but one of the nice things is that there's all this theorizing out there. Now we'll have some empirical stuff that we can put these things together and maybe come up with an account of these things that make sense both of our philosophical intuitions and of the science. So what is happiness? So does the correct model of happiness-sustaining processes place prima facie constraints on the truth about the nature of happy lives? Okay, so there's a question. Okay, so far I've been using this fudge word, sustain. These processes sustain happy lives. Now, let's pretend, I'm going to answer yes, let's pretend that the hedonistic model is true. Okay, now I've already told you that I don't think it's going to turn out to be true, but it's a theory that everybody sort of, I think, intuitively understands, so let's just stick with that. So let's suppose that the psychologists discover that this is actually the structure of all happy lives, that net pleasant feelings are the drivers of our positive attitudes, of our successes, of our beneficial traits, and somehow we keep getting these net pleasant feelings. Okay? Would this give us some reason to adopt hedonism? That is the view that happiness just is net pleasure. So would it? So or would this? If the psychology turned out that way, would it say absolutely nothing about the right theory to adopt of happiness? Okay, well, what I want to suggest is it would be weird if the hedonist picture of happiness sustaining causal processes, if that turned out to be true, it would be weird to go with virtue theory. Happiness is virtue plus maybe some luck. Desire theory, happiness is success in terms of getting what you want. Again, maybe you idealized in some ways. Life satisfaction theory, happiness is having a positive attitude towards your life. It would be weird to go with one of those theories if this is true of the world. Okay, now what do I mean by weird? And I really went crazy with the scare quotes there, right? I certainly don't mean contradictory. What I do mean is sort of inelegant. These theories are prima facie less justified on the grounds of coherence, simplicity, unification. And let me give you an example of why this is. Okay, so why am I as happy or unhappy as I am? The psychologists discovered that the hedonistic model was the right model. They would have an answer. Net pleasure. How can I get happier? Boost your net pleasure. How can I stay happy? Maintain your net pleasure. Why did I become unhappy? Negative net pleasure. So what is happiness? Getting what you want. Okay, you laughed, right? Maybe you laughed because I was waiting for you to react to this, right? But it's just weird to say this, right? It's just really weird to say this. And your laughter is exactly why it's weird. So it just doesn't fit. So I actually think that the way the psychology turns out is going to have some effect on the right theory to adopt. So, but again, you might push me on this, and philosophers do, right? Philosophers have pushed me on this. So, but why think that the model of the causal structure of happy lives is also a model of happiness or well-being, something that's valuable? Well, let's pretend that the theory that you've adopted, all right, makes sense of the science of happiness. Okay? So that positive psychology is the study of that. Right? So we say, here's the causal structure. So what does positive psychology study? These processes. Okay. And let's suppose also that it makes sense of our common sense well-being judgments, such that when we're talking about well-being in the world, we say, oh, that person is very happy, that person is not so happy, that person is hard to, sort of borderline. Make sense of those judgments. So most of those common sense judgments that we use all the time turn out to be true or roughly true. Okay, let's suppose that's what your theory does. And your theory does this, it makes sense of the psychology, and it makes sense of our common sense judgments way better than any other alternative theory. Now, if your theory doesn't do these things, then you should go back to the drawing board. Or maybe you conclude that there's nothing in the world that really makes sense of all that evidence. But let's pretend that your theory does make sense of all that evidence. By interest of the best explanation, your model is probably the true model of well-being. Right? Just look, your account best explains all these facts about happiness. So by interest of the best explanation, your model is probably the true model of well-being. Okay? So if you can get a model to do all those things. Finally, normativity. Right? For philosophers, this is a big one. For psychologists, I think they often, I don't know why you guys get so upset about normativity, but for philosophers, it's a big one, right? So it's explain how this is valuable. Okay, so explain how this is valuable. So It's a very difficult philosophical problem. Now, I have some ideas about how to address it, and if somebody asks me, and I have an appendix where I talk about this, but unfortunately a number of you have seen it already as applied to rationality a couple days ago, but I could go through it again. But for now, I don't want to talk about how I try to address the normativity challenge. What I want to say is, like, for now, I want to discuss two different approaches to addressing the problem, two different ways of, if you're a philosopher, of studying well-being. So the normativity first approach, it says, look, first we got to figure out why well-being is valuable, or what it is for it to be valuable, because we already know well-being is valuable. So often people will start with, look, we want to talk about reasons that we have for promoting our well-being, or reasons that you have for doing things. This is all sort of a normativity first approach. So first we solve the problem of normativity, then we try and figure out what well-being is. Okay, so, and look, in some respects I think this is the standard approach that ethicists have taken to the problem of well-being. But I want to suggest maybe we should adopt the normativity last approach. First, let's figure out what well-being is. And look, as I've already said, we have a lot of evidence about well-being. We have our common sense judgments, right? About, oh, that person has a lot of well-being, that person's very happy, that person borderline, that person not very happy at all, doesn't have much well-being at all. We also have all the science of happiness. So we have all this evidence, and philosophers who engage in the normativity first approach, they're just ignoring all that evidence, or at least a lot of it, and saying, first, we got to solve the problem of normativity, and then we'll work on what well-being is. Now I figure, let's take the easy step first, right? Why not do the easy thing first? We'll try and build an account of well-being that accounts for all this evidence, and then we'll figure out why it's valuable. Okay. So, a plea for normativity last. So, coming to consensus about the nature of normativity is going to be hard, right? Really hard. Coming to consensus about the causal structure of happiness-sustaining processes is also going to be hard, but it's not going to be figuring out normativity hard. So, why not start with the easier task, right? I mean, look, if you have two tasks before you, and one will get you an answer to what well-being is, and the other one will get you an answer of what well-being is, and the one task will get you that answer way sooner than the other one, why wouldn't you do the one that's easier? The end.
Thank you. So I have a question about all the models you've been looking at and presenting to us. They all have the same features. They're all very commonsensical in the sense that all their components involve basically folk psychology, common sense psychology. Now, it may not be an issue. You may think it's actually a first pass, or it may be, in fact, a high-level description. But one may think that a proper model of the causal loops that you're describing will not be put in those terms. It may well be put in genetics, neuroscientific terms, or what have you. So if you think that's a possible answer, what's the relation between the models you're describing and that type of maybe model for the future?
I definitely think that's a realistic possibility, and I think there's some work in that direction. We're not anywhere close to those yet, but in some respects, I'm far more wedded to the approach than I am to the answers I give to the approach, or certainly to any of the models that I proposed here. These models were just supposed to sort of be, well, look, this might be the sort of thing that, given the current state of positive psychology, this might be the sort of thing that they're sort of getting at. But no, I take that to be a totally live option, given what we know. Yeah. Yeah. I. Right. No, I think it's all possible. I mean, it would. So it might be that that a model cashed out in sort of genetic and neuroscientific terms will be a reduction of these sorts of things. But it also might turn out to be the case that the lower level processes are just so darn different from the higher level processes that we might say, oh no, actually it turns out that well-being or happiness is fragmented, and so in some sense happiness doesn't really exist, or there's a whole bunch of things. Or it could, we could be limitativist, right? We could say this way of talking, is just so, it categorizes the world in such a wrong way that we should just get rid of it and adopt new and more powerful ways of thinking about these issues. I take those to be, and again, and one of my pleas for psychologists to think about things in this way, and for philosophers to think about this way, is that it leaves open the possibility for all these really exciting outcomes, right? I mean, look, one way, you're way too polite to put the question this way, but one way to put your question is, geez, your models are so damn boring. Well, what if we got some really cool, fun, wild, exciting models? Wouldn't that be better? Yeah, it would be better. Totally.
I want to challenge your weird, inelegant claim that doing time would be bad, because I mean, you recognize that the FAST model is a multiple model, right? The FDA and the LSNT are different, so it's still very possible that the reason why we have been able to find a unitary and philosophical answer to all these questions is because some aspects come from the F's, other come from the A, so maybe you can get like the question of why am I unhappy comes why, I don't know, I don't remember which were the questions, but maybe some of them you're going to ask are going to answer by appealing to feelings, and other ones you're going to answer by appealing to the successes, and then in the end the reason why it's a unified model is because we have this empirical data that they all come together. Good. And that would not be inelegant, I think.
Good. All right, so let me reframe your question slightly, and if you think that I've screwed up your question, you can ask it again. But here's the way I used to worry about it a lot. And so think about it. Suppose what's on a network theory where it's all these states, and they're, who knows exactly what states are in it, and they're all interconnected, and who knows exactly how they're interconnected. They might be interconnected for you different from the way they're interconnected for me. Say, okay, but let's focus on my well-being. What is it for my well-being to improve? What would it be for my well-being tomorrow to be better, for me to be better off tomorrow than I am today, or to be worse off tomorrow than I am today? And here are a number of things that would be very bad for my theory. If I said, well, if I had more net pleasure tomorrow, then I would be better off. If I had less net pleasure tomorrow, I'd be worse off. Because then it seems like my theory is just hedonism. Right? If I said, well, tomorrow I'm better off if I have more successes, right? If I get more of what I want, then again, you see, oh, so really, look, you're just, all this process stuff is just, fancy dancing. Really, you're a desire theorist. And so forth and so on, right? So how can you account for, the gradation, the degrees of well-being in a way that isn't ultimately a unified theory? Because it seems like that's what we're looking for. We're looking for a single explanation for why you're better off tomorrow than you are today. Okay. Yeah, and that problem really worried me for a long time. But tell me if that's not your problem.
It's because when you give the argument of why you think that would be inelegant, can we try getting the slide with the many questions that end up with, oh yeah, but what is happening? Oh yeah, for example, I mean, wouldn't it be possible that you have, why am I as unhappy as I am? You appeal to pleasure, but how can I get happier? You appeal to successes or something like that.
Oh, yeah,
How can I stay happy? You appeal to, because they are not the same questions. So
oh yeah, okay.
So that's what I mean.
You're asking a question that I think I can answer easier. But in some sense, it's your question and my question are different, but the answers are basically the same. So here's the way to think about it. I think you're absolutely right that that's the way. And how can I get happier? The answer for you might be different from the answer to me, right?
Because of what you said about
That's
coaching
right, because
and judging.
of the diversity of happy lives. Yeah, absolutely. This just fits with a network theory, right? Fits with a network theory. But of course, here I was assuming hedonism. Okay, so to some extent you're saying, but look, that assumption is sort of dopey, or at least you're saying, right? Because if net pleasure really is the sort of the causal driver, the one and only causal driver of these things, then these are all the right answers. But what you're really saying is, look, I don't believe that there's just going to be one causal driver for these things. And I agree with you, which is why I embrace the network.
Okay, no, that's not what I was trying to say, is that I don't think that all these questions are just rephrasing of the question, what is the causal driver of happiness? I think these are different questions, and that is why if so, you can be a hedonist and give to be an essentialist or something, give a very strong role to hedonism, but then answer these questions differently because they are constrained maybe as advices or maybe they are. So that's what I was thinking was what you were criticizing as saying that would be an inelegant answer.
But there, look, what you're really saying, how can I get happier? You're saying, have more success, do something that you're successful with, because ultimately that's going to boost your happiness. Yes. Right. But again, that's just, you know, yeah. So yes. So the hedonist will be able to say, look, you should have more friends, you should do these things. But ultimately, if it's good advice for the hedonist, it's going to be advice that boosts your net pleasure. Right? And what I took you to be asking is, well, look, what if your life is going to be better off if you have more success? Say if you have a better relationship with your children, even if that doesn't bring you any greater happiness, any greater net, positive feelings. And that's the sort of answer I wanna allow for. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, as you know, I'm very interested in the normative questions, so I was wondering if you could go to the normative appendix. And
Okay, yeah, the normative appendix. Does somebody else want to ask a question not on normativity? And we'll see if we have time for me to go through the normative stuff, or do people really want to see what I have to say about normativity? Yeah? Yeah, so what you've heard so far is one paper I'm writing. This is a different paper I'm writing. I'll get through it sort of quickly. So, got to get to the appendix. How to account for normativity? So the normativity challenge. So here's the normativity challenge. We have a normative category. So moral goodness, epistemic justification, well-being, rationality. And I apologize to those of you who were at my talk on Tuesday. This is going to be quite repetitive. It's a category whose instances are intrinsically valuable, and you propose a purely descriptive account of that normative category. Okay? So classic case, utilitarianism, right? Just simple act utilitarianism. I take that to be a descriptive account of a normative category, of the category of morally right action or something like that. So the challenge is that your purely descriptive account must fail because it can't account for normativity. Okay, so I've described all these facts in the world, facts that scientists can measure, facts that ultimately reduce to purely physical facts. So where's the normativity? Where's the value? Okay, so your purely descriptive account must fail of this normative category. So there's the challenge. Okay, so let's set up the challenge. And I've already sort of done this, so I'll go through this quickly. So we're going to assume, and again, this is sort of a normativity last approach. So since it's a normativity last approach, I get to assume, okay, my theory is going to do some pretty wonderful things. Okay, there's no such theory in existence, but for the purposes of the normative challenge, this theory that I've proposed to you does these wonderful things. One thing it does is that here's all the well-being claims you're disposed to make. Here I'll just put a oval around it, okay? And I draw a line between them. Here, over here on this side, these are the things you think those people don't have well-being. Over here are all your judgments that those people do have well-being. Okay, and maybe there's some in the middle, not sure, doesn't matter. My theory draws that line perfectly. So every time you say that person has high well-being, my theory agrees with you, and every time you say that person doesn't have high well-being, my theory agrees with you, okay? So that's the first thing we do. So it accounts for case judgments, and then it accounts for the psychological evidence. Again, I already talked about that, right? So it organizes and makes sense of the areas of psychology that investigate well-being. Okay? And again, let's suppose it does this really, really well, better than any other theory. It just does this amazing well. Now remember, this is purely descriptive stuff. Okay? It makes sense of a theory that's out there, a theory that studies descriptive stuff, and it divides up your judgments perfectly to the ones that you say, your well-being judgments perfectly. Okay? Now, the normativity challenge is, given this theory, let's say this theory says well-being is identical to D, all right, where D is just a set of descriptive claims. Okay, so these claims right here, they refer to purely descriptive facts about the world. Okay, so the normativity challenge is, okay, your theory does. How does it count for the normativity of well-being? Okay, for the fact that well-being is intrinsically valuable. Okay, well, here's an argument that won't convince anybody that I've solved the normativity challenge. Okay, but it's an argument that's worth just putting out there. Okay, I'm telling you right now, it's not going to convince you, but I'm going to put it out there. Okay. Step one: well-being is identical to D. You can, if this is too weird for you, just assume act utilitarianism. So morally good action, maximizing net happiness. Okay. Now, the problem is that theory has lots and lots of counterexamples. Right? I'm assuming this theory doesn't have counterexamples. Why should we believe that? Inference is the best explanation. Right? It explains your judgments extraordinarily well. It makes sense of the scientific evidence. So it's that well-being is normative. Well, look, if you're laying down the normativity challenge, you and I agree on that. If you don't agree with 2, if you don't believe 2, then you wouldn't be laying down the normativity challenge. But you wouldn't be saying, account for normativity, but there's no such thing as normativity. Or well-being isn't normative. But you wouldn't be saying that, right? If you're saying account for the normativity of well-being, you got to think well-being is normative. And so, D is normative. It follows that D is normative since they're identical. And so you should be at least as confident as this as you are in that. Now, I said, it's not going to convince you, but there's an argument for thinking that this set of facts is normative. Now, I know why you're not going to be satisfied, because really the normativity challenge isn't really what you wanted. You didn't want me to explain that D is normative, that it's intrinsically valuable. You wanted me to explain why it's intrinsically valuable. It's not enough to show that D is intrinsically valuable. You must explain how it can possibly be that this descriptive, just these facts in the world, how can they be normative? That's the challenge. That's what keeps philosophers up at night. Okay? So, now look, there's a response that you as a philosopher want to make. It's a good, solid, honest response, and it's the wrong response. Okay? The good, solid, honest response is the wrong response to make. And here's what you're going to want to do. I know it's what you're going to want to do. First, to respond to this challenge, I have to adopt a theory of normativity. So I need a theory of what it is for something to be intrinsically valuable. And then I have to show, given this theory of normativity, that D, these facts, are intrinsically valuable. Okay? So that's the wrong response. I'm just going to call that the wrong response. Okay? Now the problem with, the reason this is the wrong response is that every theory of normativity is extremely controversial. Okay? Extremely controversial. So let's review where we are. So we have a strong case for thinking that well-being is identical to D, all that evidence. We have a strong case for thinking that D is normative. It's a simple argument. Why conjoin this theory with an extremely controversial account of normativity. Why would I do that? I have this theory. You're asking me to tie my baby to a burning Zeppelin, right? If that's what you want me to do. And I'm not going to do that. I worked really hard to come up with a theory that explains all the evidence, and now you want to say, no, now what I want you to do is choose from among these really crappy theories, and then attach that, conjoin that with all your beautiful, wonderful baby. Well, I'm not going to do that, okay? So I think that's totally the wrong response, okay? I think that people who defend descriptive theories, we get suckered by people laying down the normativity challenge into adopting the wrong response. So what is the right response then? Look, I wish I could have told you this, you know, when I started thinking about this a long time ago, before I had gray hair, but no, it took me this long to come up with. The right response to the explanatory normativity challenge is what I call the divide and conquer response. And here's what it is. It says, look, I'm not going to embrace the burning Zeppelin, but you clearly have an idea of what this burning Zeppelin looks like, okay? Or what the non-burning Zeppelin is like. So you tell me what you think normativity is, okay? You tell me, I'm not embracing any burning Zeppelin, but you tell me what you think normativity is, and then I'm going to give you one of three responses, okay? I'm either going to say, look, on that account of normativity, D is normative. If you adopt that account of it, so I'm going to call that victory, right? That's victory. Illegitimate. Okay, I admit that D is not normative if that's your account of normativity, but this version of the normativity challenge is illegitimate. I don't think that a correct theory of well-being should have to satisfy this normativity challenge. And then the third one is what I call on balance. And that is, okay, on this account, D isn't normative, but now you have a choice. Okay, you clearly embrace this account of normativity. So notice what I've done. I've made you embrace the burning Zeppelin. Right? Okay, so you're proposing this account of normativity, but I also have this theory that explains a whole lot of stuff, and it explains it really well and explains it better than any alternative theory. So we're in a dilemma here. Which one do you accept? On your epistemology, do you accept the highly controversial theory of normativity that you're insisting upon, that most other people in the profession think is a burning Zeppelin? Or do you accept my beautiful theory of well-being that accounts for all this evidence, yada, yada, yada? So on balance, you should reject your account of normativity because it's a burning Zeppelin and embrace my account of well-being. And here's the trick. As long as I can claim victory at least once, then I think I'm doing pretty good. All right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run through some of the challenges. So again, one of the things that you really need to do, I think, in thinking about normativity is, and it's a little aggressive. So again, people used to level, okay, but how are you going to account for the normativity of well-being? How are you going to account for the normativity of rationality? And it's a little aggressive. We have to say, well, you tell me what you think normativity is, and I'll answer your question. Okay? So here are some possibilities. Okay? And maybe I've missed some, but I think these are sort of the biggest possibilities. So one is Moore's challenge. Okay? And there's various versions of Moore's challenge, but you can detect Moore's challenge because really what they're saying is that, look, if you look at the meaning of well-being, what well-being means, or the content of the concept of well-being, there's some magical element, there's some normative element in there, okay, that's not exhausted by purely descriptive content. Okay, there's something in the concept of well-being or the concept of rationality, or the concept of good that is not identical to any concatenation of purely descriptive claims. Okay? Sometimes this is framed as a naturalistic fallacy, sometimes no ought from an is. But I take this, what you're really doing is it's a semantic claim. Moore's challenge is a semantic challenge. It's a challenge to explain the meaning of a term or the meaning of a normative term or meaning of a normative concept. And I think the thing to do in the face of Moore's challenge, so if you get the sense that people are leveling Moore's challenge, what you do is say, look, you think that there's some essentially normative content to the concept of well-being or to the meaning of well-being. I'm just going to grant you that. Let's suppose it's true. I'm not going to fight you on the semantics of it. So I'm going to grant that no purely descriptive theory will meet Moore's challenge. Okay? No purely descriptive theory. But a good theory of well-being tells us what well-being is. Remember, step one of the simple argument was not the meaning of well-being is identical to the meaning of this long descriptive claim. That wasn't the claim. This is identical to that. Doesn't it? So a theory about the nature of well-being is no more required to account for the ordinary meaning of the expression well-being than a theory about the nature of water is required to account for the meaning of the ordinary expression water. So Moore's challenge is illegitimate because the correct view about what well-being is should drive how we understand it. Our potentially confused understanding of well-being shouldn't drive how we understand what well-being actually is. So Moore's challenge, placed in category 2, illegitimate challenge. It's not a challenge that a theory, again, if I were accounting for the meaning of the term well-being, then Moore's challenge would defeat me. If I granted you that the meaning of well-being has some magical normative content. But I'm happy to grant you that because that's not what the theory is about. Hume's challenge. All right, so another Hume's challenge often is put in the form of, somebody adopts the attitude of a cantankerous 14-year-old and says, make me care. And so if Sandra is rational in the sense that she's motivated to efficiently pursue her goals, that is Humean rationality, explain why Sandra necessarily has some overridable, prima facie, pro tanto motivation to pursue her well-being. Okay? So that's Hume's challenge. If you're rational in a Humean sense of rationality, show me that I have a reason to pursue my well-being, even if I don't want it. Okay? Now look, a desire theory will meet Hume's challenge. So if you think well-being is just getting what you want, then, and if you embrace a desire theory or some kind of desire theory, then yeah, you're gonna claim victory when it comes to Hume's challenge. I do not embrace a desire theory. I think desire theories are false. So then, and again, it's not just a claim. I think I have arguments for why a desire theory is false. So if the best theory isn't a desire theory, then the Hume's challenge is illegitimate for a very simple reason. If the desire theory isn't true, then it's possible for Sandra, no matter how instrumentally rational, to just not care about well-being. That's definitely possible. And so it's illegitimate to demand that a theory implies she must care, because it's not true that she must care. And the reason it's illegitimate to make that demand is that it's illegitimate to demand that a true theory implies something false. But look, in general, it seems to me, Hume's demand, I've never really understood it. But why we shouldn't reject a theory of anything because it can't make a psychopath or an interlocutor who's copped an attitude of subtle and obstreperousness to care about X. The theory of evolution doesn't fall because grumpy Gus doesn't care about evolution. There's no reason to reject a theory about well-being or justice or morality or species or quirks or rationality because we can't talk someone into caring about it who's dead set on not caring about it. So again, I think Hume's challenge is illegitimate, or if you have a desire theory, you get to claim victory. Kant's challenge. This will be the last one I do. I have a couple other challenges. maybe I should do Boyd's challenge, but Kant's challenge. Explain why Sandra has an objective reason that's perhaps overridable to pursue well-being, a reason that stands even if she lacks any desire or more motivation to do so. Okay. Now look, the notion of objective reasons, that you have a reason to do something even if you have no interest whatsoever in doing it, is difficult and obscure. Okay? It's not clear they exist, and if they do exist, it's not clear what they involve. So plug any account of objective reasons into Kant's challenge, and there's two options. One, the theory, given your account of reasons, objective reasons, the theory meets Kant's challenge, then I get to claim victory. Okay, then my theory does explain normativity, if that's what you mean by normativity. You can see where I'm going to go with this, right? But if my theory doesn't meet the challenge, then I'm going to go for unbalanced. Right? Well, we should retain the more solid theory of well-being and reject the more controversial and obscure Kantian requirement. I'll do one more very quickly, just to show that I can get victory at least once. And that's Boyd's challenge. So look, the thing about Boyd's theory of normativity is that it's not very popular among philosophers. But Richard Boyd defines moral goodness and value in terms of homeostatically clustered states that satisfy important human needs. And so what you need to do is explain well-being in terms of networks of states that satisfy important human needs. Well, that's exactly what all these theories were doing. So you get victory on Boyd's challenge, and you get either unbalanced or illegitimate on the other challenges. And so there's no reason to lose sleep over normativity anymore. Okay, well, thank you very much. It was fun.
Okay, we are going to start with our last talk. The name of the talk is Artificial Intelligence, Extended Mind, and Self-Organizing Institutional Perturbations, an approach from complex legal constructivism.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I apologize for arriving late. Today I have a family problem. Well, and thank you very much for inviting me, the invitation to be here. Jonathan, mainly, Paula, thank you very much. Well, the goal of the talk is to respond to the research question, the main research question. Does cognitive science and complexity theory help to enhance the efficacy of law, particularly legal institutions, and its effects in the construction of social reality? In order to respond to this question, I have been working in the development of new kind of legal theory that I call complex legal constructivism, and I define that in the following terms. It is an epistemic, theoretical, and methodological framework in relationship with the traditional legal theory that mainly works with the integration of contemporary cognitive sciences and complexity theory in order to update the understanding of the way in which positive law, codes, constitutions, etc., and a legal theory influencing the construction of social reality through individual agents on institutions. Some concepts from cognitive science that I will take for granted here, but I mentioned it, that we have different styles of processing information, the thesis of embodied cognition, that mental models arrive from our embodied cognition, dynamics, the thesis of situated cognition, the enaction, the concept of cognitive niches and affordances, some concepts from cognitive sciences, complex sciences, complex system, self-organization, emergence, turbulence, which will be interesting here, because that corresponds to an input that produces change in the self-organizing properties of the system in order to obtain a new dynamics. For instance, a vaccine produce the self-organization of the immunological system in order to make emerge a particular dynamics. And in this slide, it is possible to explain how these two different domains are connected. In this context, we have a particular kind of cognitive niche in which there are different agencies, the hub situated cognition, certain states of embodied cognition, certain mental models that arrive as the result of their training as stockbrokers. There is no central control unit, but as the result of the self-organizing processes that take place among them, the stock quote arrives, emerge daily. We can see that there are different artifacts that provide the possibility of different affordances from which they take advantage. That will be interesting later because that will be related with the concept of legal institution. From the philosophy of language, I take the difference of cognitive rules and institutional facts proposed by John Searle. John Searle distinguishes between root and institutional facts. Regulative rules, root facts can exist independently of the rules that can create it. For example, parking a car. But institutional facts can only exist because there are some rules that have created. For instance, a chess fact can exist in the world because previously the game has been created by constitutive rules. Even if Searle is not particularly interested in the legal domain, I endorse the thesis that legal systems are systems of constitutive rules, and that these constitutive rules produce legal institutional facts. For instance, to identify in the world of fraud, presupposed that fraud is part of the criminal code. If this article is repealed, it is not possible to find in the world of fraud anymore. There is something interesting with this property of constitutive rules. They create frameworks in which infinite number of dynamics can emerge. For instance, in the case of soccer, even if they share the same constitutive rules, it is impossible to find two matches exactly the same. It is exactly the same phenomenon in the case of cases in courts. But there is something very interesting, that within this framework and the institutional legal facts, frequently arrive a kind of complementary normativity that produce even counterproductive effects within the institution that became institutionalized. For instance, corruption. Corruption is the result of complementary normativity that arise within the framework created by the constitutive properties of the legal system. To give an example, to remind that research that probably you know very well, Philippe Zimbardo, the Lucifer effect. He constructed an artificial prison in Yale, in the Stanford University, and he introduced some variables in the behavior of students. And the result has been the emergence of the dynamics of real prisons, and dynamics of evil in students. Later, he tried to see if the same kind of variables will be present in real contexts. And he found that it was the case, for instance, in Abu Ghraib. That means that it is possible within the institutions to make emerge certain kind of dynamics, introducing determined kind of variables. There's something interesting here from the perspective of the legal system, because all the different institutions in our daily life are created by the law. Universities as the result of the constitutive function of the legal system. The center is the result of a presidential rule. Hospitals are institutions created by the legal system. But in some occasions, for instance, what happens with prisons is very known worldwide that they are schools of crime, independently of this legal system, cultures, economy, etc. It seems that the nature of the legal institution produce the counterproductive effects. Well, the question is it possible to construct a sanctuary effect in order as a kind of antidote to the Lucifer effect? If Zimbardo has induced these self-organizing processes for obtaining evil, it is possible to contrast that with another kind of strategies. And here is a main question of complex legal constructivism. Is how to produce turbulences in systems sub-emerging and self-organizing processes to obtain specific emerging dynamics. This is not exactly the way in which lawyers think. The law tries to determine behavior individualistically. They think in particular agents and what is the behavior that they must respect. They are not considering the dynamics of the system and how to change the behavior of every one of the agents, determining by the global state of all the system. The changement of Saint-George effect, what could be? Well, probably is a project. The name is Legal Constructivism, Cognition, Complexity, and Law. It's part of the program Frontiers of the Science, supported by the National Council of Science and Technology. What happened in Mexico? And not only in Mexico, we can find more or less the same phenomenon in different parts of Latin America and probably in Ibero-America. I don't know what happened, for instance, in Anglo-Saxon systems, but we can find a lot of similarities in this kind of emergent counterproductive dynamics. Let me to give some examples. I think that there are two main kinds of these problems. Some are linked with morally wrong decisions at the institutions. Others are related with technical wrong decisions, and others were problems in epistemology, in epistemic justification of the decisions. Let me to give some examples in Mexico, Mexican institutions. An agent of the public prosecutor's office says that in Mexico, each agent is required to present a weekly number of arrested people, and all of the agents comply with this requirement because their efficiency is measured by the number of arrested people, and not matter, that's important, if the inquiry was made correctly or if there is really no crime to prosecute. A police officer narrates how people who know the movement of the public prosecutor's office arrive 1, 3, or more times for the same crime. The real innocent people stay in prison. Some examples of epistemic problems. A young woman is in prison for the robbery of a simple teddy bear, but no one proved that in fact the robbery took place, and the only evidence they have are photographs of the teddy bear in the shelf and another of the shelf without the teddy bear. We have here the quotation, they are real cases. The main evidence presented by the Attorney General's office to accuse Jacinta Francisco of kidnapping 6 members of the Federal Investigation Agency was the photograph of a local newspaper. The indigenous Ñaño Otomi was sentenced to 21 years in prison. And we have surrealistic cases. A judge said, I remember the case of a young man whose innocence was so obvious that I declared him guilty. I assumed that the second judicial level would find him innocent. Pity it wasn't so. Lex dura, said Lex, this is a very old maxim, that corresponds to one of the main assumptions in the civil law tradition, that means the legal rules must be applied regardless any other reason for not to do it. It is the base of some deep beliefs in the legal community. For instance, that legal rules are objective artifacts and that for every case there are only a correct answer. In opposition to this thesis, I claim that legal rules are not objective artifacts and there are different plausible solutions for the same case. Well, I think that the assessment of a legal system presupposes not only decisions correctly from the perspective of the legal system, they must accomplish decisions that must be morally acceptable and epistemically justified. Then judges must face three main problems: technical, moral, and epistemological problems. And what could be, or what they say of the solution for the problem of the lack of epistemological justification? We have been working in the development of an artificial intelligence system. The name is Expertise. We have taken into consideration the complexity of the knowledge of judges that must process information that comes from legislation, jurisprudence, etc. We used cognitive task analysis techniques for the judge knowledge elicitation with two different strategies. Extra-systemic strategy, which consists in the study of 400 files from the part on which the evidence is assessed. Intrasystemic elicitation, and here we used qualitative research strategies in order to elicit the information. Judges are really very complicated at the moment to provide information, and it was necessary to reorganize the information according to different phases of the process. That is the result of one part of the strategy of representation. There is a phase in the legal process in which judges must accomplish task analysis, particular task analysis. They must face different kind of problems, technical problems, moral problems, epistemical problems, for instance. And in the practice, as a result of heuristics, they have developed certain strategies for solving these problems. This corresponds to the heuristic knowledge developed with the practice. But there is another kind of superficial knowledge which corresponds to the argumentation. We have developed this kind of charts to represent the dialogical opposition between the parts. That's an example. Red and blue are in contradiction. The circles represent propositions, the squares represent the evidence, and we can see that there are certain numbers which represents the epistemic weight of the evidence. And we can see that in this case, blue win the case, red became defeated. That produced certain kind of problems to analyze the 400 cases. And I propose to change that with the same function to this kind of chart, in which we have the probandum propositions, the evidentiary elements that support the propositions, and the dialogical opposition is represented in the same line. Well, as the result of the study, we have found patterns, some templates, and atypical scenarios which consist with difficult cases. That is the representation of the knowledge in general. We can see, for instance, that heuristics determine the way in which the superficial level of the argumentation is constructed. And the theory transformed into a system. That corresponds to the first screen of Expertise. And we can see here another kind of screens. It is asking for the task analysis, the kind of problem, and the solution. For instance, in this case, it's asking for reasons that support evidence. It is asking for the kind of proofs and in order to determine if they can be accepted or not. And even it provides certain advice in order to give which are the epistemic weights for every one of the different proofs in a particular case. The system can represent the charts in order to justify in which the system is going to make decisions. There is an inferential module that at the end provides with the final result of the argumentative process. Well, but what happened with the second point? What happened with the problem with morality? There are some essays to enhance morality. Some of them are related with pharmacological solutions. Others are trying to use, for instance, transcranial magnetical stimulation. And the third view is to try to use artificial intelligence to improve morality. In recent stay in Oxford, I discussed about the possibility to use that idea, but not in a widespread and open moral enhancement, but in the cognitive niche which correspond to a legal institution, and particular judicial institutions. There is this project, we are beginning with this project. There is the group, the members of the group, and the universities which are involved. We can see that Oxford, Harvard, and our university. Probably this November we will have our meeting in order to determine what could be the design of the system, what could be the kind of expert, etc. The future research is neurology, which is not really very future. We are working about it with Daniel and with my team, Patricia, Raul. We are working in trying to know what happened in the judge's brain when they make decisions. But we are starting. I hope that in the next symposium we will give some results. Some final remarks. Law creates agents, institutions, and networks of institutions which make part of an heterogeneous, complex, adaptive system from whose self-organizing properties emerge the social reality. Law does not contribute directly to the construction of social reality. It creates institutional cognitive niches within which a counterproductive complementary normativity frequently emerge. The counterproductive properties of legal institutions cannot be changed through new legislation. That's the way in which traditional lawyers think. If there is a social problem, we can change the law and we will solve the problem. That's not true. But through the induction of turbulences in the dynamics of their self-organizing properties, one of these variables could be an artificial intelligence system. There are another, because there are different kind of problems that need to be faced. And that's all. Complex legal constructivism can be good to make the efficacy of legal system come true, and the efficacy of legal system is a necessary condition of the existence of a legal system. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Enrique. Is there any question?
Axel.
I mean, thank you for your presentation. This is a very, very ambitious project, right? So I still would need to see a lot more detail.
I will
So
invite you. That's the logic of the project.
Oh, so you want us to partake in it, so it's still in process. So let me just ask a question about
Yes.
an aspect that you were very clear about why that was a problem, which is about the so-called St. George effect, right? So I don't understand if what your claim was that whatever explanation we give for the Lucifer effect, we're going to get something similar for a St. George effect, or whether what you're looking for is something more normative, something like what can we do to avoid Lucifer effects to develop a St. George effect. What are you interested in? What are these?
Yeah.
Which one of these two questions the one that interests you, and what have you achieved so far?
Well, the main point is, if it was possible to introduce certain variables in a cognitive niche artificially, in order to make emerge these evil dynamics, the hypothesis, it must be possible to introduce another variables in order to obtain self-organizing processes and to get the dynamics, not evil, the good dynamics of the systems. It is not clear, because in the case of complexity science, there are no causal relationships. It is not deterministic. But I assume that there are particular variables that we can attack in order to produce this change. Probably it could be necessary to study the topology of the network and the institutions in order, for instance, to identify the hubs, which are the hubs in which are the strategies to affect that hubs in order to change the general dynamics of the system. One possibility is an intelligent system that widespread in all the system of the judicial epistemological community the best possible solutions. Nowadays, different courts work independently without communication among them. And I think that it's a very important variable to change that. Another could be a change in the strategies of training judges. Training judges, how to teach judges but in the practical context, not to repeat in the law, but based in the problems that they need to face, how to train judges based probably in problem approach and case approach, etc. And another have to do with the kind of artifacts that you have in your cognitive niche. Do you have enough databases? Do you have an expert system? Which are the affordances that you have? And probably the most important is to open the institutions to the society, taking advantage of the concept of open government. What happens if, for instance, the result of the knowledge representation can be studied in statistical terms, and these results are known by the civil society? Probably that produces a change which is not possible to get today at the interior within the institutions, but outside the institution. Yeah, thank you very much.
Is there any other question? Well, Enrique, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah.